Welcome back to the CSP Elite Baseball Development Podcast. I'm your host, Eric Cressey, and this is another edition of Pinch Hit Friday. Today, I want to talk about scap loading. For those of you who don't know, this is the position of scapular retraction that takes place during the pitching delivery. It's something that's heavily misunderstood. I think you see a lot of pitching coaches out there who think they need to chase it and create it. They'll actually give drills to athletes where they're actively retracting their scapula during the throwing motion. And what I really think this is a consequence of is folks looking too much at still frame photos when evaluating the pitching delivery. Really, high-speed camera footage, slow motion video tells us so much more about how scap loading actually occurs. It's very much a consequence. It's a secondary thing that takes place because of good sequencing. So in other words, if hip-shoulder separation works the way that it should, scap loading should occur. You don't have to actively chase it. So consider a pitcher from the overhead view. Just for the sake of simplicity, let's talk about a right-handed pitcher. So there's going to be a point in time during this pitcher's delivery where the pelvis rotates counterclockwise towards the plate while the torso, the thorax, is still rotating clockwise towards second base. So this is the position, where you can get oblique strains and things like that take place because they're effectively working in opposite directions. But this is what takes place when we're talking about hip-shoulder separation. And it really is set into motion by good hip loading, good direction in the delivery that basically allow for it to take place. And when you have this position of pelvis opening towards the plate while the torso remains more closed off, it gives rise to this thoracic rotation that then allows scapular retraction, the scap load, to take place prior to max extra rotation. So this is a sequential thing that takes place. Sometimes, though, you will see athletes where there doesn't seem to be nearly as much of that scapular retraction, and we have to wonder why. The first thing I would say is poor direction from the delivery can play into this. So if you have a right-handed pitcher that is moving towards the third base dugout too much, it's going to be really, really hard for him to chase an aggressive scap load because that would effectively take his shoulder blade away from the plate too much to orient himself to actually throw strikes. So many cases, the scap load can be improved just by improving the direction and delivery, focusing on being a little bit more linear, trying to stay in a narrow hallway while you're pitching. But another one that can actually take place mechanically lower down in the delivery is overcoached hip loading. So if you have an athlete that gets into a really deep squat, they try to get super, super hingy, this can actually create a scenario where they've poorly timed up their ability to actually get to hip shoulder separation. So you find these athletes just never really get into a clean layback because they've been stuck, so to speak. They have to race to get back on time in order to actually get into the position where they can actually throw a ball to the plate. So in these positions, usually it's a deep, overly counter-rotated position. And effectively what happens is they kind of just spin out of everything altogether so that the hip-shoulder separation never takes place. Instead, the pelvis and the thorax work together. So let's speak to just a couple of the lower half kind of predispositions to not having good scapula, but there are some physical limitations. Above all else is there's inadequate available motion to get into hip shoulder separation. So poor rotational capacity is a big deal. This could be a loss of either passive range of motion because of tissue stiffness or active range of motion because there just isn't good motor control to actually work into those positions. We see this, on the passive range of motion limitation side a lot when we see players who have gone through what we call highly compressive strength programs. So really, really heavy bilateral loading often can create a loss of, systemic rotation over the course of the time. That's not just, hip and thoracic rotation. It could be shoulder motion. It could be pronation, supination. It could be tibial internal rotation, cervical rotation, all these things that you need to preserve your systemic rotational capacity. Certainly athletes who just don't pay attention to mobility, they may stiffen up over the course of time, particularly if they're not involved in a lot of rotational activities. And then certainly, there's always the possibility there's been a recent injury. Somebody's pulled an oblique or had a low back strain or, a disc surgery for their spine or something like that, where it actually gets them in a position where they're hesitant in the position of separation. So they aren't really, comfortable being vulnerable in that really separated position that allows them to eventually chase scap loading. And then last but not least, one that I think is really overlooked is just a lack of shoulder external rotation. Typically these athletes are never going to be able to get into a lot of shoulder ER, so they just step away from a really aggressive scap load strategy because you effectively need to scap load prior to chasing max shoulder external rotation. So what they'll do is they'll play around their sequencing a little bit. Usually when you have an athlete that has very limited shoulder external rotation, so for me that's really anything under the 105 degrees, two things will happen. First, you'll have a heavy predisposition to subscapularis injuries. There's some research out there that shows that you can predict 85% of subscapularis tears by less than 106 degrees of shoulder external rotation. These athletes just can't lay it back, so they're more inclined to blow out a subscap or even an anterior capsule trying to get their arm back. But just as significantly, what the compensatory movement will be is they will actually climb higher with their arm slots. So you'll see a lot of guys who throw from, more up and down slots. These are your classic four seams, splitters, curveballs guys that work up and down in the zone. If they have limited shoulder external rotation, they will chase a higher slot typically. When you have a higher slot, it's going to be a little bit harder to get as much scap retraction or scap loading as you might get with a lower delivery. But big take home from this podcast, above all else, is that you do not have to actively chase scap loading. Drills that force you to retract your scap are very, very misdirected. Instead, scap loading happens as a consequence of quality movement, things that you can work on in the weight room, in physical therapy, with manual therapy, all that stuff, high quality warm-ups, and more importantly, what happens earlier in your delivery. Good scap loading is a secondary occurrence to good sequencing in the pitching delivery. Hope this helps, and I hope you're off to a great 2025. Today's episode is brought to you by Anchor Training. If you haven't heard of Anchor, you need to, because this is an equipment innovation that's disrupting the fitness, strength and conditioning, and rehabilitation industries in the best possible way. Anchor is an attachment that rigs up easily to power racks or support beams, and it can be also wall mounted. Once it's set up, you can do chops, lifts, rotational patterns, presses, rows, and a variety of arm care exercises. Basically, if you can do it on a functional trainer or conventional cable setup, you can do it on Anchor, but at a dramatically lower price and with much less space taken up. For these reasons, it's a perfect addition to baseball facilities and home gyms that may have limited space and budget. We have multiple units at both Cressey sports performance facilities and use them regularly with our athletes. Additionally, over the lifespan of the product, the maintenance costs are very low. We pay over $300 each year for parts and labors to replace cables on each of the functional trainers at our facility. Swapping it out for an Anchor cable costs about 1/6 that amount and as simple as shipping it back to the company who sends out a replacement. Perhaps most importantly, Anchor travels extremely light. You can throw it in a backpack or a suitcase and not even realize it's there. I know of coaches and players that are taking these units on the road to overcome under-equipped minor league weight rooms and hotel gyms. So when all is said and done, it saves space, money, and headaches while also offering the benefits of portability. To learn more, head to www.anchortraining and enter the coupon code Cressey at checkout to save 10% on your order. That's Anchor Training, ANCORE training.com, and the coupon code is Cressey, CRESSEY, to save 10% on your order. This has been a great addition to our training facilities, and I'm confident you'll find it equally beneficial.